Welcome to the Generic Tech Support YouTube channel. By watching this channel, you are accepting that the content on this channel is intended for educational purposes only. We strive to provide valuable information to help you enhance your technical understanding. We do not condone the use of pirated software. Please respect local copyright laws and support software developers by using legitimate purchased products. All testing conducted on this channel is done in compliance with the Consumer Review Fairness Act and the United States Fair Use Act under Copyright Law, Section 107 of the U.S. Copyright Act. We aim to provide honest reviews, security configuration tricks, tips, and how-tos. While we make every effort to deliver 100% tested solutions, we acknowledge that we don't know everything. If you have additional insights or corrections, please share them in the comments. Like and subscribe to keep up with the latest OS reviews and security tips. Your support helps us continue to provide valuable content.
Hey guys, so I got asked by a viewer on doing a video for configuration of core server. So what we're looking at right now is the logon prompt for Microsoft Windows Server 2022 Core Edition. So what Core is it's a OS that doesn't have a GUI. It's all command line. There's options in here for command line of CMD as well as PowerShell. I think in 2022, it's now the default is PowerShell. However, you could still use CMD by just typing CMD in the PowerShell console. You also get the option for the sconfig. The sconfig is the configuration manager built into Server 2000, really, I think it's 2012 R2 and forward, where you can run the sconfig to actually update the system. Now, I may be wrong. It may be 2008 R2. I'm a little fuzzy on the memory portion of that as to when sconfig became a thing. But the sconfig is basically system config or system configuration. It's a tool that's command line based that gives you the options to set an IP address, change a name, things like that, so you don't have to go through the PowerShell configuration. So much like all things Windows, when you do Control-Alt-Delete, you got to put your password in. So I put the password in, we'll hit Enter. There we go. So once we get Enter, we'll see that we're actually getting the, the sconfig will auto-load, right? So we have the Windows Server Configuration Manager here for sconfig. And we have already renamed this machine, but it's really simple to manage a core server. Now, as far as managing the core server, it's just all numeric based. So you see on the left-hand side here, we have numbers. Now, this particular screen is zoomed in. I do apologize. It probably looks a little off. Unfortunately, there's really no reason for me to install VMware tools on a core-based server because you're not going to get anything better than really the command line box anyway. So that's the graphics you get. Now, the sconfig does exist in all versions of server, whether or not it has the GUI or not. This particular, again, has no GUI, but if you do have the GUI, you could run CMD as admin and then type in sconfig and you'll get the same box. So you could still manage a non-core server through the sconfig. And if you don't know about this tool and you run a server environment, you're doing yourself an injustice because this is the best way to install updates. If you use the GUI, it's slow, it's laggy. However, sconfig is fast. You can update the server in record time compared to the actual GUI. So if you're not using that already, definitely check out number 6 in your sconfig settings, which will give you the options to run Windows updates on the server without having to deal with all the BS that goes along with the GUI. Some of the other things that you'll see in here is I already have the telemetry settings turned off. So that means that the spyware that Microsoft gives you free of charge with every version of Windows, you could disable in the core version of the operating system. If we needed to, we could go into number 2 and we could rename the computer. It's really simple. You just hit number 2 and you can literally just type in the name of the machine, hit enter, and it'll reboot the machine or allow you to reboot the machine. It'll give you the option for Y for yes or N for no to reboot the system. Another thing that you could do here is you could add the system to a domain. You could add a local administrator account. So if you want to add another admin account to the system, you could do it through here. You could also exit out of here and just use command line to do that. So you could create accounts or you could use the netuse user commands and you could reset the passwords just like you would in a regular version of Windows. Again, we can install updates. We could set the update settings from download now or download only to download and install or download to schedule or whatever it is you want to set there. You can enable remote desktop if you really wanted to. There's really no reason because if RDP into it, all you're going to get is the same screen and command line logic. You don't get the ability to do the full GUI. That's not the way the core operating system works. One of the things you will need probably to do on your server is set a static IP address. That's number 8. So we could just hit number 8 in here just so we could take a look at it. And we'll see in here, it'll tell us to select an adapter. Now, if you have more than one adapter in here, obviously the index number will change between the multiple adapters. But on this one, we just hit number 1. And then in here, we can see the IP address of this system. We can see the subnet mask that we have set. We have our default gateway and our DNS. We'll notice that our DNS is set to the IP address. And the reason why is we're going to promote this headless core server to a domain controller. Now, once you have all your settings set, obviously you would choose number 1 if you want to change the adapter setting. Number 2 if you want to set your DNS. Number 3 if you wanted to clear your DNS settings. For this one, we're not going to change anything, so we're just going to hit enter. And we'll go back to the previous screen. So in the previous screen, what we're going to do now is we're going to need to actually go to our command line. So we'll see number 15. It'll say exit to command line or PowerShell. So we're just going to type in 15 and hit enter. And that's going to bring us specifically to our command line, which in this case is PowerShell. Now, if we wanted to, again, we could do CMD and we could drop down to the old school command prompt or command line. And once we're in the command line, what we could do, and now you could do this in either PowerShell or CMD, but for the sake of this, I'm just going to run it in CMD, is we're going to want to disable the Windows firewall, at least temporarily. We could turn it back on, but right now we want to disable it just so that way we can connect to the system with our management server. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to build an additional server, but the additional server is not going to be the core server. It's going to be a headed version of the server. And the reason why is because we're going to use the server manager to configure a domain controller and a file server. And then once we have it configured, we're actually just going to kill that one server, the one with the GUI. And we could use the remote server administrative tools, or RSAT, on a Windows 10 or a Windows 11 system to control our 2022 server and set all our settings up. So that way you could run a core-based server, do the easy config. Now, I know there's a lot of people out there going to say, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. You just use PowerShell and yada, yada. And yes, you could do that. You could even create a WIM file and do the configuration off of that. I'm not going to do those things because, again, I'm trying to make this somewhat easy for you to follow along at home so that you can create yourself a lab and how to maintain and manage. Now, if you want to go into the meat and potatoes on setting PowerShell scripts, doing the installation through command logic, not needing a jump PC, let me know down in the comments. I could create some kind of a lab for that as well. But for the sake of this, I figured I would try to do this as easy as possible for you to follow along on the configuration of a core-based server for a home setup. Again, if we're talking a business setup, if we're talking enterprise stuff, then generally speaking, you're going to want to create the WIM file. You're going to want to create the configuration through your PowerShell. You're going to want to set up all your commands. You're going to want to do things based off of the company you're working with, not do it this way. This is more along the ways of trying to help people set this up for a home server. And keep in mind that if we're talking the difference between a core server and a full-on server as far as resources is concerned, yeah, the full server is going to require a little more visual graphics, and that is an overhead into your RAM, so you may lose 256 megs of RAM to your video processing in order to get the GUI. But as far as the OS is concerned, there's really not much of a difference when it comes to performance of the core-based server versus a GUI-based 2022 server, especially when we're talking about Active Directory. Now, if we're talking in a situation where you have 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 users, and the idea is that you could save some money on hardware by using a core operating system, yeah, to some extent that does work, but you're going to make up for it most of the time if you don't have internal IT to manage it. Because managed service providers, which is really the people that are going to remote into these systems and take care of them if you don't have an internal IT staff, they generally don't know core servers. Most of them are going to be techs, maybe junior low-level engineers. You may get a high-level engineer from time to time, but you're going to pay for it if you're going to pay for a high-level engineer. So at the end of the day, going core for a company that doesn't have an internal staff doesn't make sense, because then you're going to end up making up the difference in payment to your managed service provider, who's going to have to use their engineering team in order to manage your servers. So at that point, long term, it'll cost you more money than it would just to buy a server that was able or capable of running a headed operating system. So let's get this configured here. So what we're going to do is we're going to type in netsh adv firewall set all profile state off, and we'll hit enter, and you'll see OK. So this is the command to shut the firewall off. Now, if I want to turn the firewall on, all I got to do is just hit the up arrow and just type in on, and now the firewall is back on. Something to keep in mind is this particular command, this works on Windows 10, Windows 11, Windows 7, Server 2008, R2, all the way to the current, and this is the way to shut the firewall off. If you're going through the services console to disable the firewall, in Windows, I believe it was 8, they changed that, so in XP days, it used to be if you shut the firewall off, the state of the firewall was off. And I can't remember if it was Vista or 7 that they started to change that, where if you turn the firewall off, it turns some of the settings on and some of the settings off. But by Windows 8, if you turn the firewall off through the services console, it actually defaults the state on. So it turns the firewall on full across the board. And it was a built-in safety feature in Windows to block the ability for people that were remotely attacking the system to disable the firewall so they could get access to everything. Because if you disable the firewall, it just re-enables the firewall. But you can't run this command unless you run it as admin. Now, UAC doesn't really exist in core, so everything is run as admin. It's important to keep in mind, so you don't really have to right-click or run as with core-based servers. It just doesn't make any difference. And while this server doesn't have a GUI, it still has GUI options and GUI menus. So some of the menus will still work. You could still run a browser in here. It doesn't come with Edge. It doesn't come with Internet Explorer, but if you download like Chrome and copied it over to the server and executed Chrome through the command line, it'll still pop up the Chrome window. You still get to the internet. So you could still use it as a core-based system with limited functionality, but it's not a full-blown OS. So some of the functions don't work. You don't have this settings menu. There is no apps. There's not, the ability to install certain things don't work. You can't patch certain things. It's not a compliant option. So if you're in a situation where you have to do GCC, or rather CMMC configuration, you're going to have a hard time with that. When you go through the audit process, they're going to want to see that you installed all the updates. And as stupid as it sounds, you can't install the updates for Microsoft Edge because Edge doesn't exist. But that's not a pass because Edge doesn't exist. That's a fail because you don't have the update, which I know is really stupid, but that's the government for you, man. I can't control that. So I'm just giving you a fair warning that if you're in a CMMC compliant infrastructure, this is not the option you want to go with. It becomes a hassle to maintain and manage. And if you get an auditor that really, really is, not technical, because there are a lot of them out there. So if you get an auditor that doesn't understand that you can't patch something that doesn't exist, you get a failure and it'll cost you a ton of money for no reason. So in those situations, you don't really want to run core. You want to run a full-blown operating system. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to jump over into our file server. Make sure we have our configuration all set, same as we do here in our domain controller. So let's jump over that real quick. Okay, so we're over in our file server, and you're going to see pretty much the same settings. We have core FS01, we're in a work group. We have remote management enabled, which is good. We need that, but we don't want remote desktop turned on, which is set to disable. We can see that. We have our time and date set already. Now, what I'll do is I'll show you, though, what I was talking about earlier with the logic boxes, how the GUI doesn't exist, but it kind of does. So if I choose number 9 here, we're going to get time and date as a pop-up, which obviously this is part of the control panel, which is a GUI, right? Because we have a mouse, the need to click on things that tells us right away that there is some GUI aspects still included in our core-based operating system. So what we'll do here is we're going to just click on OK, because we have our time set already. this is not the time I'm in. This is not the time location. This is not the time zone. I change it up for the sake of the videos so that way you guys feel like I'm close to you. So, okay, so we have that set. We have our telemetry turned off. Windows is activated. This server, the other server, and the third server, so the domain controller, the file server, and then the remote control system, as well as the RSAT system, they will never see the light of day as far as the internet is concerned, so there's really no reason to run the updates on these systems for the sake of this. And there's really no reason for any kind of additional configuration as far as the activation and stuff like that, because it's just not it's a test system for a proof of concept, and there's really no reason for us to do that here. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to drop back here now to PowerShell, and we're going to stay in PowerShell this time. And we're going to do the same command, netsh adv firewall set all profile state off. So there we go. Firewall is now turned off on our file server as well. So we have a static IP address on both boxes. We have the systems named. We have the configuration set to look at itself for the domain controller that we're going to promote. And we have the firewall turned off on both systems, at least temporarily, until we could get things set up. So now we're going to jump into the GUI-based server. So we could do the initial configuration of these boxes and bring them up. Now, once that configuration is done, we could ditch that server, or we could just turn it off and not use it and leave it there. So that way in the future, if we want to make any changes, we can. Again, this is not the 100% right way to do this. Usually when you're running a core, you want to run a WIM file for configuration, or you want to do everything through PowerShell. But again, as just a proof of concept to be able to provide people that want to set this up, at least learn a little bit about it from the get-go and see how they can manage it, remotely connect to it, or even maintain it from a managed service provider perspective, I figure this will be helpful for you guys. So let's continue on and get into the actual server for our management and configuration. Okay, so we are now on the server that has the GUI, and this is a 2022 server standard. What we're going to do first here is we want to make sure that all of our servers that we set up are pingable and reachable. So I'm just going to open up a command prompt on the server, and we're going to actually ping these IP addresses to make sure that we can see them. So ping 192.168.135.10, which should be our soon-to-be domain controller. And we can ping that. I'm going to go to 11, which should be our soon-to-be file server. And we can ping that. Now, we shouldn't be able to ping our jump box because the Windows firewall is still turned on that box. We can see that that is the case. And then we get our destination host unreachable for 13, which is going to be our own IP address on the server. And we're going to see that here for this system. So we can ping the servers telling us that the servers are live, so we should be able to communicate with them at this point. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to do the configuration. And to do that, we're just going to click on Start, and we're going to go to Server Manager. Now, depending on your hardware, Server Manager may take a while to load up for the first time. On this particular system, it's quick, but that doesn't mean it's going to be quick on every system. I've seen servers that, you can right-click on stuff and it takes 5 minutes for them to react because they're boat anchors. Over time, systems get slow, they get old, and they should be replaced. However, because this is set up for a lab, chances are that old, slow hardware is what you have to work with. So be patient because it may take a while. You see a bar across the top here that'll flash, and you won't be able to really do anything until that bar finishes. Okay, so let's take a look at our all servers configuration here. And we're going to see our core control, which is going to be the system we're on right now. What we're going to do is we're going to right click and we're going to choose to add servers. Now what we're going to do is we're going to choose DNS. And you're going to see in here that it's going to say computer name or IP address. Now obviously, if we're setting up a domain controller for the first time, DNS is not an option because we don't have DNS configured. You could create a hosts file and add the information in there if you really want to use the host name, but it's not necessary. So for the sake of this, what we're going to do is we're going to add our file server and our future domain controller, which really is our future file server and our future domain controller. And in order to do that, we're just going to type the IP address in, 192.168.135.10, and we're going to do a search. Okay, so our search finished, and we can see the IP address of the server. keep in mind the search is not going to be fast. Even if you're on the fastest hardware in the world, it's going to search for the host name of 192.168.135.10 for whatever reason before it switches to search the DNS IP address of the same number. I don't know if it's a bug or if it's just poor development and configuration in the Microsoft server environment, but it's existed that way for a long time. So be patient while it does the search. We're going to click on the arrow to point over to add the additional system or selected system. Then we're going to go back into our IP address and change this to 11 and do another search. Okay, so our search finished on that one as well. And we're going to see core FS01. We're going to hit the arrow again to copy it over. So now we have DC01 and FS01. We're going to choose OK. Okay, guys, so at this point, you realize that we got an error, right? And actually expected to get an error. And the reason why is because we haven't configured our WinRM yet for trusted clients. And that's required. So we need to set up a trust between this system and our non-GUI systems. So that way we can communicate, because that doesn't exist in the core-based configuration out of the box. We don't have a GUI to really configure it on there. We could go through the whole song and dance of configuration, but we're going to have to create some kind of script to actually do this. So let's jump into our PowerShell console, into the ISE, so that way we can take a look at it together and work through specifically what's required and set up the trust, so that way we can actually communicate with the two headless clients. Okay, so what we have here is we have our PowerShell commands set. Now I'm going to show you what these are specifically and what they do. The first one is going to get the information, right? So this is going to tell us what the trusted hosts are that are configured for our current system. So if you highlight this and hit F8 on the keyboard, it'll only run the individual highlighted command. So we're just going to hit F8. We'll see the trusted hosts, and we'll see that we have nothing listed here. So since we know specifically that these are the trusted systems we want to add, we could just run this one script. However, if you're in a situation where you're going to have constant in and out servers that you're building, you could trust everything, but this is a dangerous thing to do, because that means that in an environment like in an enterprise environment or an actual business environment, if you run that, that means that anything that comes into the infrastructure would have full control to do things through the WinRM, which is a really bad idea. So what we're going to do for this is we're just going to run this second command. Again, since this is a lab, and if you wanted to do it, you could use the wildcard with the asterisk to trust everything. So we'll get notification that we want to add this trusted. Yes. Great. We'll go back up to the top one here, and we're going to hit F8 again. And we're going to see the values. So we'll have trusted hosts value. Okay, so now what we have to do is we have to grab this command and we have to modify it. And specifically, we have to modify it to remove core DC01 and change it to allow our remote system and the FS01, and then on FS01, remove FS01 and use the DC01 in our remote system. So that way, all three systems are trusted to communicate with each other. So let's jump into the other core servers and run this command real quick, modified to each server. Okay, so it should look something like this. Again, to get back to this from the sconfig is just option number 15. So we're going to set the configuration now. Presumably this should run without an issue as long as you don't misspell it or mistype. So let's do that real quick. We're going to choose yes. Okay, so that's set. Now we're going to jump over to our DC01 to do the same thing. And what we're going to do is we're going to do the same exact command, but change FS01 to DC01. Now keep in mind, you can't really paste these into this. So if you're in a situation where you have one machine, you're trying to paste it over, you're going to have to type it out. So it's kind of a pain in the neck, but it is what it is. So let's jump over into the other system. Okay, so you'll notice now, I just rebooted the system. It just came back up. We have our system now shows as activated. We should be able to do the same thing here if we just right click and choose refresh. We'll see the bar go across the top. So that's how you know whether or not that command worked to add your trusted clients to your server. Again, you'll have to run this on your two VMs, or rather not your VMs, I'm sorry. I'm running this in a VM environment. But you'll have to run this on your two core servers, as well as running this on the control system, the system that's going to control everything. And you'll notice that once you do that, you reboot the entire environment, you come back up, you'll go into here, you'll still see error at the top. It'll still give you a warning. But what you'll be able to do is you'll be able to just right click on the thing and choose to refresh. And once you do that, it should show activated, and then you have access and control over that remote system. Now, I will say that in some situations, the do not do this asterisk where you just trust everything is necessary. And the reason why is because since we don't have an established domain yet, we don't have a way to create a trust for like asterisk dot whatever the domain name is .com to trust just the domain. So as a result, sometimes you can't trust just the host name. Sometimes you can't access the host name since you don't have DNS. You can add the IP address, comma, the other IP address. That works sometimes as well, but then sometimes the system will translate it and then go directly to DNS and still throw an error. And when those situations occur, then you do want to use the asterisk, which is why in some cases, if you get that error message and you refresh and you still can't see those systems, first thing to do is make sure your firewall is turned off on all 3 systems, that NetSH command. Next thing to do, obviously, is if you haven't run that WinRM command through PowerShell, got to do that to add the trust. If that still doesn't work, try as a last result to add the asterisk and reboot your equipment, and then try the refresh again. And it should connect. If it doesn't at that point, throw something down in the comments, and hopefully either myself or somebody else that's familiar with this infrastructure type of setup can help you out. Again, this is a community of techs. This channel is really designed to help each other out, so throw something down below if you need help. Okay, so now we have access and connection set. What we're going to do is we're going to actually promote this domain controller, or at least add the domain controller functions to it. So we're going to right-click on the server, and we're going to choose Add Roles and Features. We're going to skip this page by default because it's not necessary. I mean, basically, if you really wanted to read it, it just tells you they should use a strong password, configuration, yada, yada, yada. So the same old generic Microsoft trying to tell you what to do, but then not listening by adding, telemetry and other garbage to record what you do. So let's just click on Next. We're going to do role-based installation. We're going to make sure that we have our server selected. So that's our core, our DC01. Choose Next. And we're going to choose to install Active Directory Domain Services. Add. We're going to install DHCP, and we're going to install a DNS server. And we're going to choose Next. And Next, 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 Next. And then we could choose to restart if required. Honestly, this should not require a restart, so you could choose that or not. It shouldn't make any difference. We'll choose to install. Now, during this process, it's installing the services. This is not DC promoting the server or promoting the server to a domain controller. It's just installing the ability to set the system up as a domain controller. Okay, so once that finishes, you're going to see stuff down here. Now, if we were doing an install local on a GUI-based server, this wouldn't show here. It would show under the flag at the top here. However, because we're doing the process as the installation here through the server manager, we'll see the option to promote this server to a domain controller. So we're just going to click on that option. Now, eventually, you'll get a pop-up that'll look like this. Now, keep in mind, you might see the system is not responding or whatever. That's normal. Just let it do its thing. It'll eventually respond. It'll eventually show you what you need to see in order to do the typical domain configuration. Now, since we're setting this up from scratch, we don't already have a domain controller active. We're going to set this up as a new forest. So we're just going to choose new forest. And we're going to call this like core AD. Dot, I don't know, local. That's fine. We'll choose next. Okay, so eventually you'll get to the screen where you can choose your directory or DSRM password. Keep in mind that when you do this way, it is a little slow. And if you're running older hardware, it's slow. And again, no disrespect, because that's what this is about, right? Is basically dumpster diving to grab old garbage so that way you could create a lab so you could learn this for free. You don't want to be in a situation where you're investing thousands of dollars into equipment or infrastructure to learn something that you decide that you hate, you don't want to support, and you don't want to do. So if you're trying to learn this stuff, grab old stuff. You could buy machines off of Amazon for like $99 for like, especially now since Windows 11 is becoming the main OS and they're going to end of life Windows 10. That means all the 7th gen processors and probably quite a bit of the 8th gen processors will just become relatively available and cheap on like Amazon or at Micro Center. You can go to either one of those locations and grab a desktop certified refurb for like 99 bucks. Those machines are totally capable of running this type of lab or scenario. And then you just go get memory. Like DDR4 memory is cheap. They made a ton of it. DDR5 is now out. People who really want performance are going to go to DDR5. DDR4 memory should be relatively simple to grab. You know, you don't have to buy ridiculously fast hard drives. These older 7th gen processors, they weren't capable of running ridiculously fast hard drives. So there's no reason to spend a ton of money on something that is basically going to be a waste. So you could go get a SATA hard drive, like a 1 terabyte hard drive for like $100. So say you have $200 invested in a machine, you could build this entire lab out. You could learn all the ins and outs of your core-based operating system or your server operating system. You don't need some high-end video card. Really, you just need a monitor, a keyboard, a mouse, and some cheap pile of garbage that you pick up for less than $200 at a store. Or if you work in an MSP and you have clients that are replacing hardware, they're going with an 8th gen, or they're ditching the 8th and 9th gens to go with a 13th or 14th gen for their Windows 11 machines because they don't see the value in spending the money for a managed service provider to come in and bill an hourly rate for like $350 for a machine that's maybe worth $150. It's not worth it to them. So those machines become garbage. And when they become garbage, just pull the hard drives out of them, make sure the companies keep the hard drives, and take the rest of the machine. You could go buy yourself a hard drive for 99 bucks, throw it in a 9th gen processor, and then run all of this stuff as your own lab. So just keep in mind that doing this process is not going to be fast, but it will work, and it'll teach you something in the process. And that's what this is about. It's about learning how to do this. All right, let's continue on here. Okay, so we're going to put our password in. We're going to set our forest and our domain level to 2016, which is the highest you could go until you get to a 2025 server. We don't want to make this a RODC. We want to make it a global catalog and a domain controller with DNS, so configuration, right? So we'll click on next. Okay, so we're going to get to our DNS portion. We're going to see an error message. That error message exists in everything. Honestly, to this day, I don't know what happens that caused that error. It has existence since 2008 server, and ultimately what happens is it throws the error and then does absolutely nothing to cause any issues in the operating system after the fact. If somebody knows why that occurs, throw it down in the comments. That would be helpful. I don't know if it's a pre-configuration, like after I do the initial server config, server manager setup, I'm supposed to go into the DNS and start a service, stop a service, or do initial configuration for the root. I have no idea. All I know is it doesn't make any difference at all when you do a domain configuration, so you can just leave that alone, ignore it. You can't click on the create DNS delegations to make any difference. So you're just going to click on next. So your NetBIOS name is going to just be the shortened name that you would put in. So if you wanted to authenticate, you would do whatever it is, / You could use a shortened name here. So for this, I could actually just choose CD and click on next. Okay, so then we'll get to where we configure our database location, log files, and sysvol. Old school people will tell you have to change this for security purposes. I'm going to tell you right now, it makes absolutely no difference whatsoever. You could do it if you wanted to like split the drive, or you want to make the drive smaller. Maybe you have more logging you want to create, or you want to create huge logs so that way you could use SNMP trapping. You could change the directory as to where that goes, so you could create tremendous logs in a separate directory so you don't eat up drive space on your local C drive. But it makes no difference from security whatsoever where you put this stuff. Years ago it did. Today it makes absolutely no difference. So we're just going to click on next. And we'll click on next. Okay, and eventually you'll get to a page here which is going to be a bunch of alerts and warnings and yada, yada, yada. It makes no difference at all. As long as you have your Windows firewall off, this will work. Even if you don't have your Windows firewall off, it'll still work. It's telling you about things with delegation and DNS and NT4 configuration and cryptography and all that other garbage. You could all configure this stuff after the fact. You don't have to do it during the installation. If you do like a Wim build or something like that, then you can kind of, get some of this to go away. But for the sake of just a regular installation, you don't have to go crazy with this. You could really secure the system after you do this, so you don't have to deal with all the scripting BS that's goes with getting rid of this during the installation process. So we're just going to click on install. So now it's going to do the installation of the domain record. So once it finishes, the server will reboot itself. When it comes back up, it'll be a domain controller. Now at that point, we're going to have to configure, if you needed to, the DHCP services. But we're not going to use the server configuration for that. We would use the RSAT configuration later in this video to do the configuration of that, as well as group policy, settings, yada, yada, yada. Okay, so eventually you'll get this notification at the top here that says the server was successfully configured as a domain controller. If you don't, let me know what the error message is. Chances are it's probably something to do with network at that point, but we could troubleshoot that together. Throw that down in the comments if you have any issues with that. We're just going to click on close. So we've got that configured already. We could complete the DHCP configuration in here. However, there's really no reason to do that because we could use the RSAT tools later in our Windows 10 or Windows 11 system to control that. So at this point, this server is configured. So being that's the case, we're going to close out of here and we're going to use the FS01. Now we're going to see the access is denied. Now, the reason why the access is denied is because the server is now a domain controller. It's no longer in workgroup mode. So as a result, we're not on the domain. We're still in workgroup mode on the server. But we haven't configured our file server yet, right? We want to add the file server to the domain. We want to set up all the file server records and configuration. So the best thing for us to do at this point is to go into the file server configuration here and add what we want to add to the file server first. Once we have that file server configured, pre-configured, we're going to add that file server to the domain. And at that point, we're going to add this system to the domain. And once the system's added to the domain, then we could go into the file server and do additional configurations, or we can manage and maintain our core DC01 server from this box. However, at this point, we are locked out of the core DC01 because we have added it to the domain, and we are no longer trusted to connect to that box. Okay, so let's right-click on our core FS01. Let's do Add Roles and Features. Let's choose Next. Make sure our FS01 is selected, which obviously at this point it's the only thing we can select because the other system is no longer trusted. So we'll choose Next. Okay, so once we get to the next screen, we're going to choose to install some functions, right? So we want to install server roles. So on this box, because we're going to use it as a file server, we're not going to use the file server configuration through the GUI, and we're not going to install it because frankly it's pointless since we're on a core server. So what we'll do is we'll install the print and document services because maybe we want to add this system also as a print server and a file server. Now generally speaking, when you do some kind of configuration like this, whether it's got a GUI or no GUI, you do not want to put print or file services on your domain controller. You want a separate box. So you want a domain controller that runs DHCP, DNS, ADDS, but you don't want to put print services on it. You don't want to put file services on it because God forbid you get ransomware. It will spread and infect everything on the infrastructure in a blink of an eye. So you don't want to do that. You want to lower the ability or the availability for ransomware to attack the full infrastructure. So if you get ransomware on a file server and you have your file server permissions configured correctly, then it may affect a couple of users, but it's likely not going to blanket the entire infrastructure. If you get the print nightmare garbage on the actual system and somebody gains access or remote access into the server, they'll gain access into your file server, but that doesn't mean they're going to get into your domain controller. So that means that you're really lowering the risk by having two different boxes with two different set of defined roles. That's why in a compliant-based build, it's a one-to-one configuration, meaning that you have your AD, you have your DNS, you have your DHCP maybe on one box, you have your file services on another box, you have your print server on another box, you have your applications on another box, your SQL box would have your databases on it. That's your configuration in a compliant infrastructure. It's a one-to-one configuration. If you get to a place and they're like, oh, we're CMMC compliant, and they have a file server, a print server, domain controller, and everything on one box, or they have running something called SBS, they're not compliant. Don't let them blow smoke. It's not true. So that's something to keep in mind with this is that when you do an installation like this, make sure you only put like roles on a box. Don't put things that can infect other things that could cause you a catastrophic nightmare in the event there's an infection or somebody gains access that isn't supposed to have access to the system. Okay, so we have print and document services. We'll click on Next. We'll go through here and see if there's anything else we want to add to this. Chances are for what we're doing, I already know right off the bat top of my head that there's really no reason for us to add anything in addition, but you can add additional things in here if you really wanted to. So we'll click on next, and we'll click on next. And we just want the print server. We don't want the LDS print services. We could add LDS if we really wanted to, but there's really no reason for us to do that. So we're just going to click on next. And then we could choose to restart if we wanted to automatically. But again, the print service role for document management isn't going to have a requirement for a reboot because it's just installing a console. So we don't have to do that. But I mean, if you really feel like it, you could do it just for the sake of testing, right? So we'll just choose that and choose install. Now it's going to install the print server on that box. Once that's finished, what we're going to do is we're going to add that system to the domain. And we will then jump back into this and add this server to the domain and then jump back into our configuration. Okay, so we can see the installation completed successful. So we're going to close this. So at this point, we have access is denied for our DC, and we have a FSO1 that now has the file services installed. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump back into FSO1 and add that system to the domain. Okay, so we are back now in FSO1, and we can see that core FSO1. We're going to see work group. We're going to choose number 1. And it's going to ask us to join a domain or work group. This is where we're going to hit D for domain and hit enter. And then we're going to have to add the name of the domain. So it was coread.local. So just enter coread.local in here, and then what we're going to do is we're going to hit enter on the keyboard. And then we're going to have to specify the domain user. So we're going to have to do cd/administrator. And we'll hit enter. And then we're going to have to enter the password to authenticate into the domain controller. Okay, so once you have your password entered, we're just going to hit enter. So you'll notice that that took almost no time. It was almost immediate. That's because, again, we're on a core-based operating system. There's really no overhead. Usually you get a little buggy, you get a little lag. It usually locks up for a couple seconds before it does it. Core doesn't do that. So, okay, guys, so what you'll do is you'll notice that you get the option to change the computer name after you join the domain. For this option, we're just going to choose N for no, and then we'll reboot the box. Okay, so when we log back into the system for the first time after the reboot added to the domain, you're going to see an additional option now to hit escape to switch users. So you'll hit escape, choose other user. So once you do that, you're going to see sign into, and you'll see CD, because that's our NetBIOS name for the server that we configured. So we're going to put our username in as administrator and then the password for administrator for the CD domain. And you'll see down here, how do I sign into another domain? I mean, you get that option, but we're not going to need that for here. So I'm like, I could choose that if I wanted to by going down on the keyboard, but there's no reason. So we're just going to choose administrator. And you're going to notice that we're going to see the sign into change to core FSO1. So what we want to do actually in here is we want to do cd/administrator. And then we're going to go to password and enter our domain password. And we just hit enter on the keyboard. And we're going to see that the system's starting up for the first time as our domain admin on the coread.local domain, still in the core FSO1 server. So we see that here. So now that we have this system added to the domain, at this point, we really have two options here. Option number one is we could use our 2022 server as our management system. So in other words, we could install the RSAT tools on our 2022 server and use that, and add the server to the domain so that we could control the systems we could then manage or maintain or update or whatever we need to do. Or we could use a Windows 10 or 11 system to do the same thing. And I think the vast majority of you probably have a 10 or 11 system somewhere that you could use to remote into these boxes, users remote server administrative tools from. Now, with that said, I wouldn't delete this server. So what I would actually do is I would still add this server to the domain. And once it's added to the domain, I would shut it off. So that way you could save the resources. But just in case you wanted to add something to the server, like you wanted to add additional roles or features to the server, using another server to do that is a lot easier than having to go through all the jumps and holes and loops and everything else of PowerShelling, scripting, and everything else. Now, obviously, over time, it would be beneficial for you to learn all the PowerShell tools and command line logic if you're going to be the type of person that's going to focus mainly on a core operating system in your career. That's a better thing to do than it is to do what we're doing in this video. However, if you just want to build a lab to mess around with, this is a lot easier than having to jump through hoops. Or again, if you're in a managed service position where you took over a client that has a headless server, core-based server, and you need to maintain or manage it, this is a really easy way to do that. So that way you don't have to learn all the PowerShell stuff or create command logic or scripts and everything else under the sun for one client. You could just use a server to do that. So that's why this is helpful. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to actually add the system to the domain. And once the system's added to the domain, I'm going to shut it off. We're going to jump into a Windows 10 system to start our configuration of our core-based servers. So I'll record this just in case you don't know on a server with a GUI 2022 edition. What we're going to do is click on Start. And usually what I do is I actually just go to File Server or Windows Explorer, and I right-click on this PC and choose Properties. And you get an option in here for Advanced Rename this PC, which is so stupid. I don't know why they changed this from just a regular management, but whatever. It doesn't exist in Core, so it only exists in the GUI. We'll choose Change, we'll choose Domain, and we're going to do core.ad.local. And hit Enter. We'll get prompted. We're going to have to do cd/administrator. Put our password in. And hit Enter. And there we go. We've added ourselves to the core AD domain. Great. Close. And we're going to have to restart this server. And when the server comes back up, it'll be part of that domain. Okay, so once the server comes back up, the first thing you want to do is check to make sure that your trusted host value has changed from an asterisk to the domain. Because while some of the time in Windows it does it, other times it doesn't. So if you have it set as asterisk, or if you have it set as, core ADFS01, and then core DC01, whatever it was, core DC01 and I think FS01 are the two servers. We want to check to make sure that those are the set systems. And if they're not set, or if they're still in there and we don't have the domain in there, we're going to have to modify the trust inside of the configuration. Okay, so what we'll do here is we're going to run our command first to see what we have in here. We're going to see that we have core DC01 and core FS01 still as our trusted hosts. But we don't really want to do that. We're going to trust the actual domain, just because, again, we're in a test environment, right? So the test domain, everything, you can access this. Now, if I wanted to change this and use fully qualified domain names, I totally could. I could add core DC01.coread.local or core FS01.coread.local. That would probably be the better way to do it, or just wipe the config completely because now we're on a domain and it's not necessary. However, for the sake of this, just because if you have any issues and you want to know how to fix this, like if you now are added to the domain, you have issues after you change this, you remove these things, you could always add the configuration by just doing that and say yes. And then at that point, if we go back in here and run this command again, we could see now that we have a trust for the asterisk.coread.local. So anything that's on the domain would be trusted to communicate with the WinRM on the servers. Obviously, this doesn't fix everything because, if something's still in workgroup that needs to access these boxes, they won't work. So you'd still have to go back to the configuration and rechange that or configure that for workgroup mode machines to access those core servers. But since we're on a domain, this isn't really necessary anymore. So if we wanted to clear this and go back to the default, which is what we want to do because, again, we're on the domain. Again, this is up to you. It's all variables that you could play around with to see how things work and what breaks and all that other yada yada fun stuff. But for the sake of this, since we're now on the domain, it's not necessary to have this in here, and it's really a security issue. What we're going to do is we're just going to clear this and revert it back to the default. And to do that, we're just going to run this specific path, this clear item path. So I'm just going to hit F5 in this case because there's only one entry in here to run this. And you'll see that it runs that. Now if I go back to the other location here and I hit F8 to run this, we'll see that we're back to our default with no source value or value. And that's what it should be after you're added to the domain. unless, again, you want to create like trust. So you could use this to trust other domains, right? So another domain, another UPN could be configured in here. So you could set these to allow other domains, set up a domain trust this way too, to allow other domains to communicate to your internal infrastructure. It's not necessary for the sake of what we're doing here, so I'm just going to remove it and set it back to the default. But it's just something to keep in mind, that if you're interested in learning how to do that, want to build this huge infrastructure of $99 desktops that you pick up, running 4 or 5 different things on each desktop, you can totally do it. So that's how you would start to do that. And obviously, if you want to learn more about trust, let me know. We can configure a trust in the infrastructure as well. All right, so let's jump onto the other 2 systems and reset those things back also to the default value so we could regain our security. And then let's do some testing to make sure that everything still functions good. And then at that point, let's jump over into our desktop. Okay, so we are now on the DC. Obviously, I'm not zoomed in. I do apologize for that, but zooming in and out of the recorder is kind of a pain in the neck, and we're not going to spend too much time here. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually check real quick to see what our items look like. Now, on this particular domain controller at this point, I've already added the desktop to it because, quite frankly, you guys should know how to add a desktop to a domain. If not, you could just literally follow exactly what we just did on the 2022 server. It's exactly the same. Just going to choose Rename Advanced and then add the system to the domain. But at any rate, let's go over here into our configuration real quick, and let's do our get item and take a look. So we just have core FS01 and core 2022 controller on our DC. Now the reason why I bring this up is because obviously I just said I added the desktop. So if this was modified and required in order for the authentication purposes or trust to actually work, then we would have seen core control 10 on here as well, which is a Windows 10 machine. We would have also seen the domain controller, the DC01 on here, which would have showed us that the DC is also a trusted site. But again, this isn't used once you add the machines to the domain or once the domain exists. So this location can be now modified. So we could go back in here now and clear this because we want to, again, reduce the possibility of an attack vector, so there's no reason to keep this in here because, again, it's not used and it just reduces security. So we're just going to reset this real quick, and then we're going to pick this video back up from a Windows 10 system. Okay, so we are on Windows 10. Now, this Windows 10 machine is already preloaded with the RSAT tool. That said, the link for the RSAT tool will be in the wiki, so you can go there and grab that, as well as all the commands and everything else that we used in this video. So if you want to save yourself the time Googling where you got to go to grab all the PowerShell scripts, you just grab them straight off the actual wiki with details and information as to what they were used for. Now, obviously, if you're trying to learn this stuff, grab them and use this as a template, right? So learn additional changes, modifications, things you could do to those actual scripts. Don't just use them and say, all right, well, I set it up and that's it. Again, this is really more designed for the home hobbyist or the MSP person or somebody that's really starting out, just to get their foot in the door to understand how this works. But use it as a basis, a foundation. Don't use it as like, I'm going to grab these scripts, I'm going to run it, and that's it. Because if you don't really know what they're doing, then that doesn't do me any good. It really doesn't do you any good. Okay, so now we have the RSAT tools installed on the system. The system has been added to the domain. We do have a static IP address on the system. I haven't configured DHCP yet. That's something that I may do, but I'm not going to authorize because obviously I screw up my network. So this isn't on its own VLAN. I just threw this as a separate subnet on the same VLAN. Probably not the greatest idea, but it's really only used for this channel, so there's really no reason to go crazy and have to do reconfiguration of all the firewall configuration for VLANing and tagging and everything else. So at any rate, let's jump into the RSAT tools and take a look at that. Okay, so we're going to click on Start. We're going to scroll down here and we're going to look for Administrative Tools. So we have Admin Center, and we also have Administrative Tools. Now keep in mind, Admin Center is different. Admin Center will give us a centralized repository location where we can manage these servers from like a web page GUI. In my experience, it's buggy. It really doesn't work that great, and even when it's at its best and it's in an enterprise environment, you're not, I mean, it's not as good as just having a physical server to actually manage the other headless servers. It just doesn't work all that well. It has its bonuses. Like if you're running hypervisor server, the old version, which was freeware, yeah, it's nice to use that because then you can configure it without having to use the sconfig, and you're not going to have to mess around with the PowerShell logic and everything on the local system. But it's still not all that great. You'd be better off with a desktop with RSAT on it than you would be with using that. Now, yeah, you do get additional functions and options not available in RSAT. That's really kind of a hybrid between RSAT and the configurations you get on the server manager. But at that point, you'd be better off just spinning up a temporary server, putting server manager and the RSAT tools on that itself, and running that to control the system. It's really not all that good. It's really kind of been replaced by like, well, I don't want to say replaced. It's really like a clone of the Azure console, which I don't know if anybody out there has used Azure, but in comparison to AWS, it's garbage. It really is. It's slow, it's buggy, and it's typical Microsoft where you have 15 different locations for the same thing, but then every location has slightly different settings to it. So it becomes a nightmare to deal with. It's very disorganized, much like most of Microsoft Windows at this point. So anyway, RSAT tools. So we're on a domain. We're logged in as the domain admin. So if I click on Active Directory users and computers, I could see the core AD here, and I can expand this. And this is our domain controller. And we could see the systems we've added. There's the file server. There's core control, which is this machine. There's the 2022 server we used to initially control it, configure the domain controller. We could also go in here and we could take a look at like DNS. Now, something I would implore you to do is on your desktop, right-click on this stuff and do pin to start. So you actually have it easy, so you don't have to scroll through this on every single thing. We'll do sites and services as well. Take a look at domains and trusts. Scroll down here. Let's do DHCP. We'll take a look at the DNS services. And we'll do a little maybe group policy configuration on this box as well. And we'll see print management, so we can right-click on this and pin this to start as well. Now, keep in mind, we could now use print management to connect to our file server that we installed our print service infrastructure or structure on. So that kind of gives us the options to control our systems. And you'll see a bunch of other stuff in here as well that you can use for configuration or remote server administration, or RSAT as it may be popularly referred to. All right, so let's take a look at DNS. And let's choose the computer. We want to connect to core dc01.coread.local. And there we go. There's our forward lookup zones, our configuration. There's our reverse lookup zones, which are not configured yet. So let's go over that real quick. We're going to right-click and we're going to choose New Zone. Then we're going to click Next. We're going to choose Primary. Click Next. Do all domain controllers running on domain control, or rather, all DNS servers running on domain controllers in this domain. Choose Next. We're going to do an IPv4 reverse lookup. Now, you could do the reverse lookup zone configuration manually down here, but it's totally... you don't need to. So what you could do is, at least in this situation, since we're talking about 192.168.135.x, it's /24, we're just going to do 192.168.135, and you're going to see it auto-populate the ARPA configuration down here for the reverse lookup zone. So we'll just click on Next. And then we're going to allow secure updates recommended for Active Directory. You could do both secure and non-secure. Now, you would use this configuration more so if you're running like old stuff, or if you have like Linux boxes or OpenDNS servers, things of that nature. So for the sake of this, we're just going to run it on the domain controller. So we'll just click on Next. And then we'll click on Finish. And there we go. Now we got a reverse lookup zone. So what is a reverse lookup zone versus a forward lookup zone? We go to Start and Run CMD. If I do NS lookup, and I do say core DC01, and I hit Enter, that's a forward lookup. If I do NS lookup, and I do 192.168.135.10, and I hit Enter, that's a reverse lookup. And you'll note that it fails. And the reason it fails is because just because we created the reverse lookup zone doesn't mean that everything that we had in our forward lookup zone has auto-populated into the reverse lookup zone. So since we have core DC01, we could actually create a new pointer record or PTR record. And we know that that's .10. And we could add the host name as core DC01 core ad.local, and we could choose OK. Or if we don't want to do that because we don't want to screw anything up, because there is a possibility of screwing stuff up when you're in here, we could actually find our record for core DC01. We could double click on this and we could choose the checkbox to update the pointer record. Click on OK. And then if I go back over here and I refresh this, we're going to see the pointer record created, the same thing that I would have created just a second ago. We're going to see it auto-created. So now if I go in here and I do an NS lookup for the reverse lookup zone and I hit enter, you'll see that it'll auto-populate to the correct name of the server. And that's the difference between a forward lookup and a reverse lookup. Okay guys, so now that you know how to create a reverse lookup zone, that's basically how you do it. If you want to, again, we have FS01. We could update the pointer record and apply it. Click OK. We could do the same thing for core control. We could update the pointer record and apply it. Hit OK. Do the same thing here and hit OK. And then we could go back into the reverse lookup zone and we could just do a refresh. And we'll see all the IP addresses in here for the reverse. Now, obviously, over time when the DHCP would refresh itself, so non-static IP addresses, when the DHCP would refresh itself, this stuff will auto-populate and auto-update itself. But if you have static addresses, the easiest way is just to go into the core AD and check the checkbox if you set this up after the fact. If you set it up before you add the systems, they'll automatically add to the reverse lookup zone as long as you have the correct subnet listed in here. Okay, so now we have this set. Let's get our DNS configuration done like we do on most of our servers. So we're going to go back up to the root here and just right-click and go to Properties. And we're going to see that we have IP addresses for an IPv6 and an IPv4. Do not change this to IPv4 only if you have Windows 10 or Windows 11 systems you're adding to your infrastructure. Because by default, even if you go into the network configuration and you disable IPv6, the system will still prefer IPv6, and when it can't communicate, you'll get latency, things won't function correctly. You may even end up with a desktop that becomes rogue and orphaned and can't communicate to the domain. You may not get group policy. Don't do that. You don't have to configure IPv6, right? So we don't have to configure IPv6, but you should let it be checked. You should still just leave it as the default configuration. So let's now look. We have forwarders. So we don't have anything set up as forwarders. We have advanced and we have root hints. Now root hints is what your DNS is going to use to look up for the internet. However, you could add a forwarder. Now, I'm sure you've seen it as an MSP person. If you are an MSP person watching this, if you go into the network and somebody has 8.8.8.8 as their primary DNS and it's on a domain, guess what? They're not authenticating to the domain. They're using cache credentials. They're not getting group policy. They're not on the infrastructure. They're not getting printers. They're not getting updates. They have access to the internet, but Google doesn't know what the heck coread.local is. They're not going to store your DNS information. So there's absolutely no reason for that to be in there. If you want to use Google DNS, this is where you do it. So we'll edit this. We'll choose 8.8.8.8 and we click elsewhere and then we click OK. Now, we're going to see attempting to resolve this machine has no access to the internet. So as a result, it's obviously not going to resolve the X outside. But on a domain controller that does have access to the internet, you add that 8.8.8.8 there, and that might have been one too many 8s. Anyway, so you add the DNS for Google there. And once you do that, what happens is your computers that are on the domain will look up, google.com, and your domain doesn't know what that is. It will forward the lookup to the Google DNS and provide the DNS back. That's where you do it. You don't do it down in the DNS configuration for your local network, because if you do that, you'll break the ability for your desktops or your laptops to communicate with your domain. Now, another thing to point out, which I see all the time, and I can't understand it for the life of me, is you could create a forwarder in here to point your DNS to another DNS server on your infrastructure. So if you want to use like OpenDNS's services, which I think is now owned by Cisco, you could do that, but you got to set up a forwarder here to forward the DNS to that DNS server so it uses it for a public external lookup. If you do that, uncheck this checkbox, because if you don't, if this address or whatever your internal DNS server forwarder address is, can't figure out what the address is and reports back to the server, it will automatically use root hints and it'll circumvent your DNS configuration for secure DNS anyway. So make sure that this is unchecked, this root hints configuration is unchecked if you're forwarding DNS to an internal DNS server. You could at that point use the root hints off of that DNS server, so if it doesn't exist, that server can look up elsewhere to get the information and then decide whether or not it's information it can provide. But if you don't do that and you leave that checked, then chances are Windows will look at that, say it's too slow, and go to root hints anyway, and then look it up there, because usually internal DNS forwarders are built on junk that is just not fast enough to do the external lookup to compete with what's available from Microsoft in the root hints. Okay, so we got that configured. We'll take a look here. We don't have anything we need to set here. Root hints configuration, we got that. That's great. Monitoring security, there's nothing really else in here. So that would be our configuration for setting up forwarders. If we go back in here now and we take a look specifically where we want to actually go, is we want to look in the actual domain itself. We want to right click and we choose properties. And then we go to name servers. This is where you should have all of your domain controllers listed. Now, if you go in here and you see crap that isn't a domain controller, if you see garbage that's in here that is a domain controller that existed maybe 5 years ago that hasn't existed since, remove it. And the reason why is because if you leave all that stale junk in here, it'll cause catastrophic latency from your client computers when they go to authenticate into the domain. Because if this server becomes overwhelmed, then how this works is the name server portion of your DNS will send that information back to the desktop and say, oh, this server is overwhelmed. Look at these other boxes. But those other boxes don't exist. So what happens is that your desktop will sit there and go, I can't communicate with him. Can't communicate with him. I can't communicate with him. And then it'll go back to that first system and go, I couldn't communicate with them. And then that system will say either, yeah, you can communicate with us now, or it'll say, we're still overwhelmed. Check these again. And it just becomes a loop where it causes that really, really slow, latent logon with authentication to occur on your desktop. So make sure that this only contains the correct IP address and the correct server name of the domain controllers that legitimately exist on your infrastructure. Something else you may see in here, which hopefully you don't, is wins. If you see wins in here and you're running just Windows 10, Windows 11, uncheck that because it's not necessary. Wins was really the precursor to DNS. So if you still have Wins infrastructure running, then you probably have Windows 2000, NT4, because technically Wins was starting to be killed off in Windows 2000. So like NT3.5, NT4, you're running really old Linux systems, you have Unix boxes, then maybe you need Wins, maybe. But even that, like AIX from IBM, at this point, they're Intel-based core processors. They don't use Wins anymore. But I mean, if you have stuff from like the 80s, like DEX systems or things of that nature, then you might want to use Wins. If not, this shouldn't exist. So this should be unchecked. Wins will also be really slow because it's not like DNS where it's, an active file system for access to do lookups. It's a flat file system. So it's going to be really slow because it's disk I/O, it's going to be disk queue length, it's going to be transfer rate, it's going to be the translation on the desktops, and the desktops in Windows 10 and 11, they know what Wins is, but they don't prefer Wins. So there's absolutely no reason to run this unless it's absolutely necessary by something you have on your infrastructure that's super legacy. And I mean super legacy because, again, Windows 2000 Service Pack 4 doesn't require Wins. Okay, so that's Wins, that's our configuration, that's understanding the name services. So that's pretty much DNS here, right? We don't really have a need and a necessity to really dig down into anything else in here. We have our name servers, same as parent. That's the IP address of the DC, that's the DC, that's the DC. We don't have any conditional forwarders. There's really no reason to jump into that right now for the sake of what this is. This is just to configure the server and get it up and running. So at this point, we could close out of DNS because we have our DNS configuration done based off of our lab. We've gone over our forward lookup zones and our reverse lookup zones, how that all works. So we don't need this open really either. But what we're going to do for the time being, we're just going to clear this. So we'll start off with a fresh command prompt or terminal window that we could use to troubleshoot the next portion of this video. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to go into DHCP. We're going to note in here, once we go into DHCP, we're not connected to a DHCP server because we actually have to add the server. So what we'll do is we'll look for our core dco1.core.ad.local. Hit OK. And there we go. That's our DHCP configuration. You'll note that we don't have anything configured in DHCP right now. But we need to configure DHCP, right? We should have DHCP configured so that way it's running correctly. Let's set this up. So what we're going to do is we're going to go IPv4. We're going to choose new scope. And we'll choose next. We're going to name it something. So for this, we'll just call it core test. We'll choose next. And then we need to do an IP range. Now an IP range is going to be especially important if you have servers and you're using a flat network. Now, if you're using VLANs and you're using tagging and then you're using your firewall to do DHCP relay, that's a different story and not this video. That's the right way to do it, especially in today's day and age. However, for the sake of this video, we're just going to create it as a flat network. Now, we know that this network is 192.168.135.x, right? So it's a /24, 255.255.255.0. But we have all of our servers, our test systems, and our controls in the early portion or the beginning portions of the subnet. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a scope of like 192.168.135.20. And then we're going to use, say, 192.168.135. We'll say 200. So that'll give us, what, 180 addresses? That's enough for the fact that this is really just a test infrastructure, right? But if you're doing, you know, an infrastructure for an enterprise, or if you're doing an infrastructure for a business, we'll go a little further into what that looks like from a DHCP scope configuration and how you should be maintaining that in 2024. Now, you're going to inherit old junk. It's going to exist. You're going to have problems. I know that already. I see it every day. However, you really do want to configure this in a way that going forward, it limits the overhead on a migration. It'll make your life easier in the future. All right, so we have our scope configured. We're going to choose next. Now, this is the exclusions, right? So if you know that like 192.168.135.21, which is inside the scope, has a printer on it that has a static address on it, that's where you would configure this. The other thing you can configure in here is the subnet delay. Now, on a network infrastructure that's 1 gig connection, and I don't mean 1 gig burst, I mean 1 gig full duplex. And I mean that you could set it static at 1 gig connection, because keep in mind there's something called auto duplexing on a lot of switches that are garbage. And auto duplexing does burst 1 gigabit connection, but most of the time it's 100 meg. 100 meg is slow. I mean, maybe not by like 2000 standards. So if you're still running wins, I mean, you know, it is what it is. But if you're on, you know, a full gig connection, this subnet delay doesn't need to be set. However, if you have hundreds of clients and you're on switches that are like 10, 15 years old and they don't support full duplex gigabit, they're auto-negotiate only 1 gig connection, chances are you want to set this to a 3 to 5 millisecond delay. So we're just going to click on 5 and we're going to choose next. Then we want to set the limit on the actual DHCP scope. Now, if it's just desktops, they're there all the time. You don't have to worry about that. You can make it whatever you want. Make it 7 days, 14 days, 12 days, it makes no difference. But if you have a lot of laptops, you have phones, like cell phones on wireless on the same subnet, which you should never, ever do. But if you do, then you don't want to make it 8 days because you'll end up exhausting your DHCP resources. You'll run out of addresses. Because if you have 50 people in the office with 50 computers, those 50 people have 50 phones and the phones are in and out of the office all the time. You'll end up in a situation where you just run out of addresses. It's common. So for that, I would say you want to set this to maybe 3 days. But you want to also adjust your logging, because if you set it for 3 days and then you find out that somebody was infected on the infrastructure, that address 6 days later is not going to be the same address, which means that you won't have the ability to go back and say, well, I don't know what device that was, or I need to know what device that was infected. You'll be able to use logging to do that. So it's important that if you adjust this, adjust the logging to match the amount of days that you limit the actual scope to, right? So if the scope is set to 7 days, make sure you have logging for at least 14. So that way, 7 days after the fact, you can go back and take a look at the infrastructure. If you have the DHCP set for 3 days, maybe set it for 6 days, so that way you have time to go back. It really depends on what your turnaround is to look at the infrastructure after the fact. How long does it take for people to report problems? If they're noisy and annoying and they're like, oh, I'm going to report the problem 3 minutes after it takes place, then obviously you don't have to set that. But also keep in mind that your audit process it'll help you in the future if you set it for longer. So for me personally, usually I split the difference and I set for 4 days. And then I usually leave it as 4 days and don't do hours and minutes, because that'll get confusing if you have to take a look, see how long the lease was for a particular client. Because if it's set to like 4 days, 3 hours, and 13 minutes, and you have to go in there and look at the DHCP listing and figure out when that system actually got that address on what day and what time for an audit, dude, that gets really muddy real quick. So you probably don't want to do that if you ever have to do an audit process. Now, if you're trying to make them like stagnant, like stagger it all over the place inside of the DHCP listing so it looks like the clients are coming and going and what times and all that other fun stuff, go for it. If you're trying to reduce the impact on the DHCP server, then do that. Adjust the minutes. But I wouldn't do it if you're in a small business, less than 100 machines, on a server that's relatively new. I would set it for 4 days. It should be fine. So then we're going to click on Next. And it's going to ask me if I want to configure the scope options now. I'm going to say no, I will configure these later, and I'll show you why in a second. So we're going to click on Next, and then we're going to click on Finish. And you're going to notice in here that we don't have our configuration set to authorize. And the reason why is because, again, this is a flat network. I don't want it sending out DHCP addresses on my configuration. Okay, so let's go over the initial configuration of our scope. And we're going to right-click on this thing and go to Properties. And we could put a description down here if we need to. It's not necessary. But more important, what we're going to look for here is DNS. And we want to go into where it says Name Protection and choose Configure and choose Enable Name Protection and OK. And the reason why you do that is because if somebody brings a duplicate name device onto your infrastructure, your server will not give an address to that duplicate name. So if somebody decides, hey, I'm going to attempt to access your infrastructure by hacking your infrastructure from the inside by naming one of my own personal devices, whatever device is allowed to be on your infrastructure, this will stop that from getting an address. It'll also stop the ability for them to clone machines. So if they cloned a machine and created a virtual machine with the same clone name, system will block that garbage. So that's something to keep in mind. It is helpful. Next thing I want to do is jump here into Advanced. And we want to take a look. And this is where you're going to see that delayed configuration for the 5 milliseconds for your old switches and your infrastructure that runs Wins. And then once we have this configured, we're just going to click on OK. Okay, so let's talk about static IP addresses real quick. If you're smart, you will not use static IP addresses on anything that doesn't physically require it. The only things that really physically require it is MS-SQL and the domain controller, and Exchange if you're still running that. Otherwise, there's nothing else on here that really requires a static IP address. You could say maybe, a web server, or, you want to run print services or blah, 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 file server. No, it's not necessary. What you do in those situations is you create a reservation. And the reason why is because in the event that you decide that you're going to migrate to a new server, all you got to do is back up the DHCP scope and import it on the other side. You don't have to recreate the wheel. You don't have to touch every single desktop to set the DNS to the new addresses. You don't have to touch every single server to set the DNS to the new addresses. You could use the reservation to do that. So you can just migrate the whole stupid thing in one click rather than having to touch 15, 20, 30 servers in the process. It'll save you hours, if not days of time to do that. And it's really simple. All you have to do is you need to know what the MAC address is. So if we go in here and we do an IP config, we're going to see the MAC address. It's going to be right here. So if I wanted to set a static reservation for that, all I'd do is do new reservation. I could call it whatever. I could call it like domain controller. Right? And I could choose this and choose 10. And then I could just set this MAC address in here and click on add. And once I clicked on add, that reservation would exist, which would store or keep that server there. Not only would it allow you to then create reservations where you won't be able to create a duplicate IP address on that same subnet. So in other words, it'll remove it from the scope, but it also designates it directly to that system. So that system will always have that address. Now, if you have super unreliable infrastructure, that may be a reason to not do that. Maybe a reason to use static IP addresses. But if your infrastructure is that unstable, then this is not the right video or the right solution for you. You shouldn't be doing core services to fix a stability issue on infrastructure and network. I mean, it does help with the overhead. It reduces that stuff. And honestly, it makes it a little more secure because the vast majority of techs aren't going to know how to manage or control it. But it's not the fix for this. If your infrastructure is in that bad a shape where you can't use reservations, you have to use static addresses because of that, it's bad news bears. Don't do that. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that with the reservation set and the ability to migrate, that means that all the DNS information will automatically populate within a 15 to 20 minute time period on the new client, the new desktop, new servers, so that way you don't have to deal with that stuff either. It's just all around a more helpful process to do. So then the question will probably come up, well, if that's the case, why did you create a pool that starts at 20 and not start at like 5? The reason why is because you still want to add static addresses specifically, written to the network adapter on certain devices. For instance, your control system, like this system right here, I would never suggest using a Windows 10 or 11 system with the RSAT tools as your daily driver that has full access to your infrastructure. However, you could use it as a jump box, right? So you can remote into it and then access it from there, but you would want to block the DNS lookup on that system, set that as a static address, and then don't add the DNS configuration on that network adapter to publish inside of the domain. And if you did that, it would block the ability for anybody that gained access into the infrastructure, hackers, ransomware, whatever, to see that device. So it would secure that device by really obscuring its identity and what it is. And that's something that some people find helpful. Another thing you could do is keep in mind is that first 20, make those their switch addresses. Maybe you have VoIP that you want to configure your PBX to a static address. Those are the systems that you would put before that .20. Maybe you have printers that won't allow DNS configuration or don't support DNS, or they're hosted or managed by somebody else and you don't have admin access into them. You want to add those things before your subnet. And then everything after the 200, well, I'm leaving a buffer, right? Because I don't know if I'm going to need another 25 addresses on the fly one day if this thing fills. That gives me a buffer to automatically expand this pool if need be to add the additional addresses. So it's just a way of doing it that you can kind of keep track of what you have going on. Now, if you get to the point where you have somebody that adds something on the inside to a static address and it needs to be inside the scope, and you start to see bad address populate inside of your DHCP zone, you create a new exclusion. And you don't even have to create a range like the start and the end. Like if we want to do 192.168.135.25, we can just click on add, close. So now it will only block that .25 from being given through the lease, through the pool itself. And then if you decide that you don't need that anymore, just delete it. But reservation is still the best way to do it. I wouldn't use the static on the newer systems if you could avoid it. Again, MS SQL and a domain controller and Exchange are a little different. Everything else should have a reservation. It's not going to bark about it. And it's also helpful because reservations, you know where they are. You don't have to document it. It's all written inside your DHCP scope. Reservations also update your DNS, whereas statics do not. Statics require static DNS entries. Or sometimes you'll add them to the domain, set the static address. It'll automatically update the static address in your DNS, but it doesn't update it on a regular, right? It's not going to, it'll have a timestamp of the day that the system was added to the domain. And it gets stale, and when you remove that system, it still exists. You got to manually remove it, but if you use a reservation, you don't. All right, so now let's talk about server options or scope options. So server options is going to be every scope that exists in your infrastructure. So if you have multiple scopes, like you have 135, maybe you have like 200, maybe you have 10 dot something, all those different scopes that are added in here, you could use a server option to define a specific address. Like maybe you have a specific NTP server you want to use for time services. Maybe you have a specific domain you want to use across the board. Maybe you have a specific gateway you want to use. Maybe you have specific DNS servers you want to use. You could define that there. Anything that's different from one scope to the other, that's where you put the scope option in. So you define the server option as the standard across the board, and then anything that's a slightly different, like maybe you have different DNS servers at each one of your scopes, you wouldn't add the DNS configuration in the server option, you add it in the scope option. And that's how you're supposed to configure this. I rarely see it set up that way. Okay, so I know that every single system that I create, I want to use a specific DNS server on the inside. Again, this is not the place to do 8.8.8.8 garbage. This is not that configuration. Do that through your forward lookups or your forwarders. Let's go into our server options and let's do configure options. All right, so we're in our configuration now for our options for our server. Again, this is for all of the subnets, right? Not just for one, but for all of the subnets. Okay, so the first server option we're going to set, which again is all the subnets, because all the subnets are on the same domain, presumably, at least in this infrastructure, is number 15, which is the DNS domain name. So we're going to choose core ad.local. And we're going to choose apply. Now, once I have core ad.local in here, you're going to see if I go to scope options, it exists here because the server options feed the scope options in each one of these subnets, right? So I know that this domain name is going to exist on every single subnet that I add in here. So if I add multiple subnets, whatever is in the server options will exist pre-configured into those server locations or that scope location. And that's important because I don't want to spend 4 days configuring DHCP. So if I have 100 different subnets I got to add into this thing, all I got to do is just set it here and then it'll automatically populate in this 100 different subnets. I don't have to set it 100 different times. Again, I never see this, and I don't know why, because this is how this is supposed to be configured. Another thing you could do is you could configure NTP time services through here. Now, it's important to keep in mind that NTP time services can be configured in multiple different ways. Now, by default, when you add a machine to the domain, that machine will automatically get its time source from the domain controller. However, if you have multiple domain controllers in multiple locations, sometimes you can end up with a skew in time. And if that happens to a certain extent, you'll not be able to log in to the domain or you lose access to your file services. That's when you usually get group policy involved. And you can use group policy to define, okay, well, the NTP server for logged on infrastructure systems, things on the domain, are going to use this domain controller for time. And you could configure multiple domain controllers to be the time source as long as you use configuration in your group policy for that location. So either you use an OU structure where only certain servers and desktops exist in a certain location, or you would have to define metrics in your configuration to force those particular NTP sources to only be used on systems that access specific locations. Or you could do it through DHCP. So you could do it as a scope option. Now, if you do it as a scope option, that defines what NTP server what system actually communicates to get its time source. If you decide that you don't want to do that, you want everything to get its time source directly from one system, whether or not that's the domain controller or not, and I mean everything, I mean your switches, your phones, everything, then you would use the server option. And in the server option, you would set your NTP time source to whatever server you wanted to give it to. Now, if you do that, what happens is that Windows will provide the time source through the DHCP scope to whatever device connects to it, which means if you have a phone that's obviously not on the domain, it'll still get the correct time on the infrastructure. So for that, what we would see is we would see 042 for NTP servers. So we could do server name or we can do IP address. For this, we're going to do IP address because, again, assuming that these systems aren't on the network, they may not have the DNS configuration necessary in order to get this. Now, obviously, once they add through the DHCP, they will have the correct DNS information. However, DNS lookups for devices using old devices, things that are skewed, things that don't work correctly, Unix-based systems, things of that nature that just are looking for a time source. Sometimes that is phones. I would just use the IP address. You could still use a server name if you want. The server name will translate to the IP address, and you can use both the DNS or the actual direct IP address. I would suggest using the IP address just because I've seen it not work with the DNS name, whereas the IP address will always work. So for that, you're going to do 192.168.135.10 because that's our domain controller, and that's what we're going to use as our provider for NTP time source. And we'll click on Apply, and we'll click on OK. And then, once again, server options, NTP server, and DNS. Now, if I go to the scope options, that's the domain name. That's the NTP time services. But now, I want to configure DNS for this particular scope, which I know is going to be different than DNS from another particular scope because I'll have a different domain controller there with a different IP address at a different site. So what I want to do is I'm going to want to configure my DNS configuration. So specifically with that, we're going to choose option number 6. And we're going to put our DNS server in, which is 192.168.135.10. We're going to add that. You're going to see it's going to check the DNS location. We're going to click on Apply. But we're not done here because we know that we also need to configure our gateway, right? Because right now, even if they get an address, they can't get out to the internet because there's no gateway configuration. So to that, what we're going to do is we're going to configure the router, right? So the router is going to be our gateway. We can actually see additional information to the right. We're going to choose 192.168.135.1. And we're going to click on OK. So now we're going to have our NTP time services. We're going to have our domain name. We're going to have our DNS server. And we're going to have our router, which is our gateway. We're going to go over into server options, and we're going to see these two things still exist. Now, these two things will exist on every scope, but the scope options that we just set, which is the difference between a little server and just a little piece of paper, is the configuration that exists only on that scope location. So that's really how DHCP should be configured. It's really not super complicated just to get the initial configuration set up the right way, which is basically what we did right here. Now, what I will say is that we can go further down into this thing and we could look at like filters, allow, and deny lists. We can do a new filter for allow and set up a MAC address and set up a description for what that is. And when you turn these filters on like that, what you could do is you could control DHCP to only allow the DHCP to give addresses to these specific MAC addresses. And in doing that, I would tell you not to use this, but to use the PowerShell on the core system itself. So you could actually use an XML file for all your MAC addresses and not have to do this on an individual basis, which will take forever on a large infrastructure. You could also create a deny list. If you wanted to, you could do the deny list without the allow list. So everything's allowed, but you could deny certain addresses or certain infrastructure. And if you do that, it'll deny those systems from ever getting an IP address handed to them. Now, it's important to note that if it already has an address, and that address was given that day, and it has 4 days until it's going to check for another address, if you set it to deny, it doesn't just stop its ability to communicate. It'll still be able to communicate with the infrastructure, but 4 days later, when it goes to get a new address, it'll be blocked. So that's something to also keep in mind, and also a really good reason why you don't want to use DHCP on a flat network, a single network like this, if you have phones, like cell phones that people bring in, because you have no control over their devices, their infrastructure, their setups, and they could have tons of viruses, ransomware, spamware, and everything else on those stupid phones. And as a result, since you have a 4-day time period, there's really no way to block it like that. You would have to do alternative measures to block it. Usually you'd have to go into your wireless routers and ban them from there versus doing it through your DHCP scope. Okay, so now we have this configured. You're going to ask me now, what about IPv6? Leave it alone. If you're not going to use it, just leave it alone. When you enable it, this will enable the IPv6 scope. It's going to give an address out to your clients. It won't make any difference. Not at all. I will show you, however, a bug that I did locate on a 2019 server that should be just at least noted, is that in the IPv6 configuration of your network adapter, for whatever reason, and I have absolutely no idea why, it will pre-configure your IPv6 DNS to do a forward to your router. And you don't want that. Usually you'll see it in here. You'll see something like this listed in there. If you see that, change this to obtain automatically and set it to OK. Because again, for some reason, there's a bug, and I can't tell if it's 2022 and a specific update version or just 2025. But when that occurs, what happens is it forwards the DNS lookups from the inside to the outside, and you'll cause domain latency for authentication. And again, you can't really disable IPv6 by just disabling the network adapter or the configuration setting for IPv6. Because if you do that, you just cause catastrophic delays in your clients because they're all communicating on IPv6 over IPv4. So it's just something to keep in mind on your, especially if you're running Windows 10 and 11. Don't do that. Leave IPv6 enabled. Okay, so at this point, we have DHCP configured. Again, I'm not going to authorize it, but if you needed to, at this point, what you do is you just do authorize, and then you'd refresh it, and you'd see that this was here. Then you'd have to go into activate to activate the actual scope, and it would activate. Now, you could activate 1 scope, 5 scopes, 12 scopes, depending on what you have in here. You don't have to activate them all at once. They don't have to all be running or not all be running. You can activate 1 or 2 of them or leave 1 or 2 of them off. That's up to you. But once you authorize this should auto-activate for the first time. After that, you can choose, activate or deny. I've had it both ways in the DHCP configuration with really no rhyme or reason as to why one was one way versus another. I don't know. Again, it could be a bug in the server in the DHCP configuration. That's a known thing. Something else to keep in mind if you're doing a DNS or rather DHCP migration, when you go in here and you do backup, it's going to back it up specifically to a certain location on the server. On the server configuration, usually that's going to be C Windows System 32 DHCP backup. When you do that, if you're going to migrate it to another box, you have to put that backup file directly back into that location to restore it from there. Because again, there's a bug somewhere in the OS that if you try to do a DHCP restore not from the backup location, UAC will block its ability to update or install correctly, and then you'll end up in a world of hurt. So just make sure that wherever your predefined backup location is on the server is where you back up to and where you grab the files from and then paste them into that same location on the other system. You'll have to move them local first, like, create a tools directory, paste them in there, and then copy them from the tools directory into there because UAC, again, will not have it, and it'll block its ability, and you'll end up in an issue where you just can't restore the DHCP backup, which from a migration perspective sucks. So just don't do that. Okay, so DHCP is done. We have our DNS configuration done. We know that we have access into Active Directory. We can see it. Go in here, we can see the server and the domain function levels and all that other fun stuff and yada, yada, yada. We could go to operations masters. We could see PDC infrastructure, RID. It's all that core DC01, which again is that headless box that we were configured and running from. We could see our predefined computer configuration location. We don't have any OU structure built. We could, however, build OU structure if we wanted to and go into group policy, access the core AD, the domain, the sites. We could create our NTP filter configuration if we wanted to. We could see our domain controller. So we do have access to everything as if we were functioning on the domain controllers or on the systems themselves. Again, that's what the RSAT tools do. And this RSAT tool stuff will work whether or not you have the GUI or not. So you could use this if you're on an internal infrastructure and your servers are all on that same infrastructure. Knock yourself out. You can use the RSAT tool so you don't have to remote into anything. As a matter of fact, it makes it a lot easier to manage and maintain the systems. But if you do that, do not run your user account as an admin. Run as a user and run all this stuff through a UAC with a password. Because if you get ransomwared or you get hacked, they'll have access to everything from one computer. So it's a giant security risk if you don't do it right and it's on a live internal infrastructure. Okay, so we took a look here. Now we can see our group policy configurations all there. Again, we have our Active Directory. Close this out. Let's go now to our print management. And specifically, let's go to print management and let's do print servers. And let's add a print server. Let's do core fs01.core ad.local. Let's do add to list. And we can actually remove the local system because we're not going to run print service right off our Windows 10 machine. So let's do OK. So now we can go in here and we can expand this. We can see printers, ports, forums, drives, etc. Yada, yada, yada. So this is where we would go now to manage or maintain our print server. So if we wanted to add printers, we could add them through here. If we wanted to configure said printers for group policy, we could do that through here. We don't have to be on the FS01 server to do that. But what about file service configuration? What if we want to create a file server? How would we do that? So this is where it gets a little muddy. And the reason why I say that is because there'll be difference of opinions in the chats and the comments, I'm sure. Now, a lot of people will tell you to use the core configuration in the server manager to configure the file services and shares. But we already know that there's a bug in the file server shares. We'll add the everyone group to everything, which is basically a giant gate. It's like literally putting a screen door and then putting a giant block of gold behind it and telling people, yeah, please don't take it. I mean, eventually you're going to come home and it's not going to be there. It's just how it is. So the idea of having a file server with the everyone group as the default group being pre-configured by the server is a bad idea. So that means using the server manager tool to actually create your file shares is pointless because you're going to have to go into every single one of them through File Explorer anyway in order to manage and maintain them or correct the actual controls, right? Because you're going to want to create security groups so you can actually share stuff secure and not create a giant gaping hole. So, do we want to use the server manager? I would say no. Again, people down there in the comments may say, oh, you got to use the server manager. It's the easiest way to do it. And they're right. It is the easiest way to do it, but it's a really bad idea because you're creating something that has a giant security flaw that you know has a giant security flaw. And at that point, there's absolutely no reason at all to run your file server on a headless system. Because if you're sharing stuff through a headless server and the headless server is pre-configured to share with everyone, then that's not secure. You kind of lose the security that the core server is supposed to give you by removing the security from your file services. So again, pointless to me. Again, other people may have difference of opinion in the comments. To me, I think it's stupid to do that. So then that leaves us with the question, well, what do you do? How do you maintain it? Well, from that, you could either use PowerShell, which I know a lot of you people out there that are younger that are starting to get into this may know or may not know. And if you don't know, you're going to have to know in order to maintain a file server directly from a core system. It becomes a fiasco. It becomes a real hassle to do it, especially if you have to bring outside tech in order to maintain and manage these systems. It can cost you a fortune. It's not worth it. But we do have the ability to still use UNC paths to get to the system. So we can manage it from a file level off of the actual Windows 10 system. Ideal? Not really. It's not the best way to do it. I would argue that it's a really bad idea in a lot of cases. However, because of the situation that we have with a core server and because of the bugs that exist in the core configuration for a core server using the server manager tool built into another server, it's still arguably a more secure way to do it than it is to do through the server manager tool. Again, I would argue that at this point, if you're going to run a file server, just use a headed server. It's honestly just a better idea because you could secure the headed server a lot easier than you can secure the core server just because of the bugs that exist in the operating system. Now, with that said, what we did is we whacked core FSO1, see $, because we are domain admins, we do have access. We're going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this thing network share. I'm going to create another folder. I'm going to call it tech. I'll create another folder and maybe call it bills. Create another folder, maybe call it everyone. So if we go into each one of these things, we could do a configuration directly through here, just as if we were on the server. We could choose properties. We could choose security. We could choose advanced. So I know you're sitting here and you're wondering, well, what do we do now? So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to create some security groups, right? So before we go into this, let's just cancel back. So we have bills, everyone, and tech. So let's go into Active Directory users and computers. Let's go into Active Directory users and computers and just right click and we're going to do new. We're going to choose organizational unit. We're going to choose groups. So we're going to go domain groups. We're going to right click on this. We're going to do new. And we're going to do organizational unit. We're going to choose file share groups. And we're going to do new. And we're going to do group. And we're going to do bill access. And we're going to do new, and we're going to do group. We'll do tech access. And then new and group. Okay, so now we have our security groups configured. We're going to go back over into our file shares here. And we're going to go to bills. Right-click, go to properties. You're going to notice that we don't have a share option in here, and that's because we're remote. So once we get the security configuration done in the GUI, we could jump back to the core server and actually share the individual folders with the correct security groups and settings. But for the time being, we're just going to do this directly through the GUI just because it's easier, right? We could see it. But it also doesn't give us the additional bug that we find in the share configuration if we use the server manager, which is enabling full access to everyone. Now, you got to understand that the everyone group, as far as the security group is concerned, what everyone means is it means anybody that has an internet connection in your infrastructure. So everyone is not a domain group. It's a built-in security group in Windows, which means that somebody in a parking lot, parked next to your building, if they have access into your Wi-Fi, can download your entire infrastructure to their machine. That's the everyone group. And that's the reason why it's such a security concern that there's that bug in the server manager configuration for a core server, which is why you don't want to do that with a file server. And because it's such a pain in the neck, presumably, again, if you're internal, this is your daily driver, you do it every day, you'll get used to using the command line to do everything. It's really not that big of a deal. But if you're young and you're coming into this as an outside source, you don't know what the configuration is, it could be a little overwhelming. It could even be scary at times because you don't want to mess anything up. And you can drastically mess something up. So in those situations, I tell you, just the file server should have a head. That's it. Just because of the maintenance. Now, the domain controller, you could argue either way, right? Because once the DC is running as it is right now, it doesn't make any difference, right? I don't need to access it 24/7, so I don't really need to make any changes. And if I do need to make any changes, the RSAT configuration works totally fine. There's really no difference. But when we're talking a file server where it's a constant change, we need to add this person, we need to remove this person, we need to do this, we need to do that. If you're coming in from the outside, not knowing the structure and the configuration, and then also possibly dealing with nested security permissions, it's going to be an absolute nightmare to maintain. And I would argue against doing it. I really would. But again, for the sake of this, getting it set up, just so that way you can have it as an access or whatever, home lab type of configuration, you can have to play with it a little bit, figure out what works for you. But I would tell you that if you're going to do it, get very used to using PowerShell because it's necessary in the file server. Okay, so we're going to disable inheritance. We're going to convert inherited permissions into explicit permissions of the object. We want to leave creator owner. We're going to remove users. And we're going to add, for bills, the principal. And what we're going to do is bills access. Choose OK. And click on Modify. We don't want to give full control. Click on OK. And click on Apply. And then replace the child objects with this permission. Now, if you check this and they have nested permissions already set, you'll write them over and then you'll screw yourself. So keep that in mind. If you don't check it and you add this to a pre-configured situation where they have nested permissions, then that user doesn't get added to the nested permissions, which also is a catastrophic disaster and a nightmare. That's why we don't do nested permissions in Windows. So we're going to click on OK. Yep. And OK. If we go back into here, we're going to see that we have administrators. Perhaps not surprisingly, there was a bit of a delay, but at any rate, figured it out. So we're going to see bill access and administrators. So what happened was I didn't give it enough time to replicate. So it does work. It is fixed. It's going. So we're going to go back into everyone. We'll do the same thing here. We'll choose everyone, security, advanced, disable, convert, users, remove, add, select principal, everyone, access, check name, okay, modify, okay, oops, once again too fast, replace everyone, great, okay, yes, okay, close, refresh. Everyone, right click in properties, we'll go to security and we'll see the everyone access and administrators. Great. Now, if you haven't watched one of the other videos, you probably don't know the reason why you don't do full control is if you give full control under a security group, any user that's under that full control security group has the ability to have full control. And that also means they have the ability to grant other users full access to files or share files and folders with people that are not permitted to have access to those files and folders. So you don't want to give full control ever. You get read and write access, but not full control. Read, write, and modify access, but not full control. Because full control gives them the ability to modify the security of the actual folders and files as well as the share. So that's something important to keep in mind. Okay, so let's do the last one, which is tech. Right click, properties, security, advanced, disable. I think I went a little too fast there. Convert, great. Users, remove, add, principal, tech, modify, great, replace, great, yep, okay, refresh, perfect. There's our tech access, we're good to go. All right, so now we got to share bills, everyone, and tech. Okay, so we are on the file server. Let me just zoom in real quick on this so you can see the screen. Okay, so specifically what we're looking at here is we're going to set up a new SME share for the name tech, which is the folder name that we created in the other screen when we were on the GUI. We're going to use the path of C, network share tech, and then the permission we're going to give it is change access. Now you could give it full control, but again, full control can modify the shares. So we're going to give it change access. Now, change access gives you read and write and modify. That's change access. So we're going to define that, and then we're going to use the security group of tech access as the defined security group that has access to that share. So we're going to hit enter. We're going to see it's created. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to do net share and hit enter. And we're going to see that I have my bills share and my tech share. Now, I did create the bills share already. I went through the process of creating it. And I'll do the same thing for the everyone group and create that as well. But that's how we have our configuration now. So we do have our shares set. So if we go back to the GUI, we should be able to see these. And if we add our user or a user to one of those security groups, we should be able to map those network drives directly to the system. We could even create a real quick group policy, reboot that desktop, log in, and it should map those network drives directly to that system. Okay, so we're back on the desktop now, as you can see. Let's open up another File Explorer window, and let's whack to the server name. So if we go to core FS01 and enter, there's our shares for bills, everyone, and tech. Right now, we're not in any of those security groups, although we are an administrator, and since the administrator group still exists, we should have access to them, but we're not added to the security group to access the actual share. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a user, add the user to the security groups, log off of this desktop, and log back in with that user account. But you know what? Perhaps before we do that, we should jump back into Active Directory and let's create a new OU. And let's call the OU domain computers. And we'll create another one and call it desktops. go back over to computers here, and we're going to grab our Core Control 10 machine, and we're going to drop it into our desktops. That's fine. And there's our 10 machine. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to jump over into group policy. I want to refresh this real quick. Okay. So there's our domain computers, there's our desktops. So let's create a new group policy object to map these shares to our desktop. So we'll right-click, choose New, and call this Map Network Drives. We're going to right-click on this and choose GPO status, all computer settings are disabled, and we're going to choose Edit. Okay, so where you're going to want to go here is under User Configuration, Preferences, Windows Settings, and then Drive Maps. And on the right-hand side, we're going to choose New Map Drive. And we're going to choose to Update. Now, you're going to say, well, it doesn't exist. Why would you update? Because there's a bug. If you create every 15 minutes, it'll disconnect and reconnect the drive when the poll takes place. If you replace, it'll disconnect the drive and reconnect the drive every 15 minutes when the poll takes place. If you update, it doesn't do that. It checks to see if that exists, and if it doesn't exist, it updates it. Now, you would use replace if there was already like an F drive, a G drive, an H drive, whatever the drive letter is. You would use it to do that, but then you would immediately go in here and change it to update. Because if you leave it as replace, every 15 minutes, it'll disconnect and reconnect the drive. So if they have something open, like an Excel doc, or they have, a Word document open, and they happen to go to save that file, or somebody else opens that file in that time period where it reconnects, they'll lose everything they worked on. And who do you think they're going to be pissed at? It's definitely going to be the IT guy, which is chances are going to be you. So do yourself a favor. Don't have a headache. Just make sure you change this to update if you have to set it as replace. And there's no reason to use create at this point. It's just pointless. It doesn't do anything for you that update won't do. Okay, so I'll run you through this real quick. You'll choose update. You'll put your location, whack server name / the file, the share name. All right, so like for instance, we're on FS01 and that's bills. Then you could create a label. You could call the label anything you want. It doesn't make any difference. Then you're going to choose your drive letter. I'm going to choose the G drive. It's in the drop down. You can choose the drive letter. Never use the A, B, C, or D drive. And if you're smart, never use A through E. F and so on is fine, but leave those alone. A is designated as well as B as being designated for floppy disks. Even though you don't use a floppy disk, systems haven't had floppy disks in probably 15 years, it's still designated that way. And some applications with dormant code or legacy configuration in them will still see these as floppy drives. And if you have a network drive mapped to it, you could cause the application to simply just cause a blue screen of death on your system. So don't use those. C is going to be your default C drive most of the time. You may have D or E drives that exist as a CD-ROM drive, and then the E drive is going to be a secondary internal drive letter. So I mean, if that's the case, just leave A through E or E through A as being not anything that's mapped to it. Now, if you run low on drive letters, then you need to redesign your infrastructure. But using those drive letter allocations, it's not a good idea. You can end up with a serious amount of problems in the future if you use those, so don't do that. Okay, so we chose the G drive. So we hit apply. Now at this point, we're going to click OK. You have to click OK and go back in here and then do new and map drive again, because if you change it thinking you applied it and then you change it and apply it again, it'll just reapply it or change the original one that you had open. So don't do that. Just do whack core FS01 / everyone. Reconnect. Label as everyone access. And then we could just choose, the F drive. That's fine. And click apply and click OK. Now we're going to do the same thing again for tech. So I'll just do whack core FS01 / tech. reconnect, tech support. And maybe for this one, we'll choose like the T drive. Great. Okay. So now we have our updates configuration for our drive mappings, right? So now we just need to apply this group policy to the OU where our user is going to be, not where the desktop is. So let's close out of here. Let's go back into Active Directory, or we could go into group policy. It doesn't really matter. They are integrated and connected. So what we're going to do is we're going to choose new OU. We're going to call it domain users. Great. Domain users. We're going to choose another new organizational unit. We're going to call it home users. And click OK. There we go. We have home users. And we're just going to map our network drive, right? So we're going to click link an existing GPO, map network drives, and click on OK. So now we have mapped network drives. So if we go into our details, or rather settings, sorry, and we do show all, we're going to see our drive mappings listed in here. So this is how this works. Now, I want to just point this out. You'll notice that I use the server name and not the IP address. And the reason why is because in Windows 7, they added, I guess, UAC. In Windows 8 and 8.1, they made it kind of mandatory. In Windows 10, it's definitely mandatory. In Windows 11, it's pretty much, you know, deal with it. That's where it is. UAC, if you use an IP address, doesn't have the IP addresses as a trusted zone. And as a result, if you go to run something, you may be blocked. So if somebody goes to run an Excel document, that even though you have, say, a trusted template for like some kind of configuration that exists inside the Excel document, it's trusted, it's allowed, it's set up, but you use the IP address instead of the domain name, that's no longer trusted. So they will get a USC prompt that has to put them in, you know, they'll have to put in credentials to run the macros in the Excel doc, which means that they won't be able to run the Excel doc or it'll throw an error. You have to use the server name. Don't use the IP address for that reason. Now, if you don't have DNS configured, you're just trying to set something up real quick to access it, use the IP address, fine. But just keep in mind, UAC will stop you in your tracks if you have customized macros in Excel documents and you don't use the server name, but you use the IP address. Okay, so we're now back in Active Directory users and computers. And you'll notice in here that we have domain users and home users. And the reason why, again, is because group policy and Active Directory are linked to the same location, so you're going to get the same structure. If you don't, you got something seriously wrong with your domain controller. Or you're pointed at a domain controller that doesn't exist anymore. So you can change the domain controller. So if you see multiple things in here and they don't exist, that's why you're not linked. Something's broken, at which point that becomes a troubleshooting video and not a build video. So let's add a user. Okay, so I entered Santa. So Santa needs access to pay bills for all the toys that he's purchased on credit card this year. Let's go into Santa's account, find the member of account, and choose add. And then we're going to look for our security groups we configured. So we know that we had bills. We're going to add that. We know that we have everyone. We know we have, was it tech? Okay, add those. We'll click apply. So there we go. Now, Santa is part of the bill access, everyone access, and tech access. So we're going to choose OK. I'm going to close this out, close this out, close this out. Now we're going to log out of the system and log back in as Santa. Okay, let's authenticate. Okay, so we loaded back up. We're in the system now. Let's jump and take a look. There we go. We have our network drives mapped. The question is do we have access? Can we create something? Can we delete it? We can. So there we go. We just created network mappings on a core-based server. and set up group policy to auto map these drives. Now, once we're in this server or this desktop again, because we are in the Windows 10 desktop again, if we go back into the administrative tools and back into Active Directory users and computers, we should be able to see everything. But we're not going to be able to do anything. So if I go into users here and go into home users and I try to create a new user, you'll see that I actually don't have the ability to do that, right? So I can't do anything with it. The reason why, again, is because I'm a user. So a domain user has access to read Active Directory, whether or not you know that. They do. You need to create delegated access controls if you want to block users the ability to actually view the domain controller, like as a user, like in Active Directory users and computers. You could do that, and then you could block their ability to see it, but still authenticate. However, out of the box, they have full access to see everything. They just can't do anything with what they can see. That becomes a security concern if somebody's trying to hack your infrastructure, though, because then they can tell who an administrator is, because they can go into the account and actually see things. So when you label things inside of your OU structure, do it in a way that's somewhat obscured, because if you put domain admins group in here and you put all the users in there and they get access as the user into it, they know who is the domain admin, obviously. Now, with that said, I'm still logged in as a user, right? I could right-click on this. I could choose more, and I could choose Run as Administrator. And when I get prompted, I could do CD/administrator. And hit OK. And now I could do new and whatever else I wanted to do, because I ran this as an administrator and authorized account. And that's how you should run remote server administrative tools on your desktop if your desktop has access to the servers. You should never have a local logon as an admin and then have the ability to, because you're causing a hole in security where if your machine gets infected, and quite frankly, your machine is a higher risk than anybody else on the infrastructure, because you're the person they're going to call to fix the issues, which means your machine has more exposure than anybody else does to possible threats and issues. So as a result, don't run RSAT tools on your local desktop unless you're a user. Don't run it as an admin. It's a bad idea. So with that said, that's it, right? We have our servers configured. We have a file server configured. We configured our print server, Active Directory, DNS, DHCP. We promoted a domain controller. We have a desktop added. We have the ability to use group policy. That's basically a core configuration. Let me know down in the comments if there's anything in addition you want to see on a core configuration. Maybe I could throw something together or add it for you. I don't know how long this infrastructure will be around. Usually don't keep things longer than like 2 or 3 months, and then I delete them off my network. So these things will sit dormant for a couple months, and if anybody has anything they want to throw together or throw something in the comments, they want to know something, you want me to change something, even if you're running into an issue where you're working as an MSP and you don't have a lab built, throw me something down in the comments. You want me to try to attempt to break something, walk you through how to fix it, throw it down there. More than happy to. Again, this is a community run YouTube channel. So, I mean, any ideas you have, anything you want to see, anything you want to learn, throw it down in the comments. If I see it, if it's possible for me to do, I'll throw it together for you, create a video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. Thanks for watching.